Hi, Joel. How are you doing?
Good, Bettina. How are you?
I'm good. Today we are going to talk about your book, one of your books, this book over here. Hang on. Right here. This one. Oops. Oh my gosh, I can't believe that just did that.
Yeah, it
Did
happens. It happens with the screens. I can do it though because I don't have.
Okay. All right. So we're going to be talking about your book, The Many-Minded Man, and as well as the Homeric question. You ready for the Homeric question?
Sure.
Okay. Well, first of all, I suppose the question is, what is the Homeric question? When people say that, what do they mean, Joel?
Well, the questions changed over time. The original Homeric question was, are both epics by the same person? Right. And so that was sort of, if you're talking about sort of post-Alexandrian period up till Friedrich Augustus Wolff in 1795, the basic question was, are the Iliad and the Odyssey by the same person? Following that, it turned into a different question, which is, all right, so let's pretend we don't have to worry about the same person. Are the Iliad and the Odyssey whole texts, or are they texts that have been stitched together by editors? And so this became sort of, it made it bipartite, a tripartite question. One, are both epics by the same person? Two, if they are or aren't by the same person, are the epics that we have the same that they had in the ancient world? And three, can we drill down to find sort of a core original Iliad, a core original Odyssey? And that's where we pretty much were with the Homeric question until Milman Parry and Albert Lord at the turn or a little after the 20th century. So I don't know how much you want to hear about oral formulaic theory. I'll make it wicked quick, right?
I have his book, Singer of Tales here. I don't want to bring it up because once I do, then it's going to
Yeah, you just
be
screw
again.
up your screen.
Yeah.
But the basic difference is that, the work of Parry and Lord, which used anthropological fieldwork and linguistic studies to show that oral poetry is a thing that exists, that you can compose in performance, and it's not tied to problems of dictation and writing and single authorship. Once people started arguing about that, we moved from one paradigm, which was Unitarians who thought the epics were whole, versus analysts who thought you could take them apart and find a core one, to our modern era, which is really, writ large oralists, people who think most of the inconsistencies or difficulties with the poems come from our misunderstanding of how oral poetry work, and textualists who acknowledge the oral derivation of the epic tradition, but focus a lot more on the intervention of a literate or more literary author near the end. So the questions today are similar to where they were before, which is that some people want to say, well, what's the original or right text of the Iliad and the Odyssey? And others want to say, well, let's adjust our expectations a bit and our understanding of what literature is and artwork is, and try to understand what we have based on what we know they came from. Today the Homeric question still sort of remains, is there an author named Homer who wrote the Iliad and the Odyssey? The answer to that question is definitively no, right? Anybody who says anything but that is just wrong-headed, and I'll say that, right? On the other side, though, in much more different way, the more interesting question is, where do the Iliad and the Odyssey come from? Why do we want to attach them to somebody named Homer? And what do we lose or gain culturally and historically when we do that?
So part one, I want to ask, who was it that first? Because the ancient people did. Who was it, or who were among the first that actually came up with the name Homer to attribute the Iliad and the Odyssey to?
So who knows? It's a really ancient, right? We have evidence for the name Homer prior to like our oldest text of Homer. Right. So among pre-Socratic philosophers like Xenophanes, Heraclitus, you get a lot of shit talking about Homer, right? Saying that Homer did this or didn't do that. And it's pretty clear that Homer was a cultural icon, an idea. And the first person to really say Homer is responsible only for the Iliad and the Odyssey, or at least the first person we're sure about, is Aristotle. Prior to that, people attributed a whole mess of stuff to Homer. The Thebais, a poem about the wars about Thebes, a bunch of different hymns. And I think really the best description or best argument about this comes from a book called The Residence of Homer by Barbara Graziosi and Johannes Hobelt, which basically argues that Homeric poetry takes a specific view on the universe that looks at what they call a pan-Hellenic character. A narrative or traditions that appeal to a wide array of Greeks, but not one single city-state. And they contrast it with Hesiotic poetry, which is from the same period and the same form, that tends to try to tell the whole story of the universe. Whereas Homeric poetry is dramatic and what they call microcosmic, getting into the themes of the universe and creation and the meaning of everything through specific moments, right? So a good contrast would be that, in the catalog of women, most of which we've lost, you'll get the story of a family, 3 generations really fast, right? And the Iliad, instead of telling 10, 20 years of the Trojan War, tries to evoke its entire story through 58 days of action, only 6 or 7 of which are actually detailed. So the complex story that's really hard to understand is that in archaic Greece, so prior to the classical period, dactylic hexameter, the language of Homer and Hesiod and others, was the language of shared poetic authority across city-state boundary, across ethnic group. People would write laws in it. They would give prophecies in it. They would tell jokes in it, right? It's just that it was the authoritative language. And so what we've lost over time is that experience of having a poetic culture, a song culture, as being bedrock to our civilization, right? To use an awkward term. And so even someone like Aristotle, I believe, is so thoroughly an illiterate and literary mindset that he can conceive of what the life of Greek culture was 200 years before his time. It's just changed too much. It's like our children today trying to understand a rotary phone or a VHS tape, right? It's ridiculous to them. My children cannot understand that there was a time when you had to wait for something to come on television and it was your only chance, right? Technology changes so fast that those of us who experience it think that is self-evident to everybody. But the next generation, it's gone. So I think there's so many layers of misunderstanding about how Homeric poetry functioned in the world that you really have to peel back the perspective and experiences of commentators to imagine the difference between their world and the world that gave us the Homeric poems.
You wrote this beautiful response to my tweet a long time ago now. Gosh, it feels like a long time ago. It might have only been a year ago, Joel. I have no idea anymore. When I was like, hey, something, something Homeric question, because that's, I'm just always so fascinated by people's opinions, especially people whose opinions I respect. So I'm like, Joel, what do you think? And then you came up with this whole tree thing, and I'm like, whoa, which was fantastic. Can you kind of sort of summarize?
Yeah, I'll summarize my tree metaphor. In the end, it's about... I'll summarize it in 2 ways. One is that as individual human beings, we have culturally framed notions of causality, and we also have a very hard time understanding aggregate effects over time. The way one small movement 1 year can have huge effects later. And so those 2 cognitive limitations of human beings really forced me to come up with different metaphors for us to understand collective creation. And the collective creation metaphor for the epic in trees is as follows, right? So you go outside and you see a beautiful tree, right? You love the tree. You're like, this tree is perfect in its setting. And you want to say, who can I thank for this tree? And the answer is really complicated, because you have to peel back where a tree came from. One, most of the trees that we plant are a product of selection and genetic engineering over time. So we found in nature this thing called a tree, and we changed it. We selected, we planted in certain ways, we changed it over time. So do we credit the people who selected the tree and planted it for this beautiful thing we have? But then, well, what about the tree in the landscape? right? So the tree sits in the landscape in a certain way, and we have basic assumptions on tree-ness and how a tree should look. So who's to thank for that? Right? The first person who put a tree in a landscape in a specific way, right? Who is that? And does it matter that we've kept doing it? Do we thank the gardener who planted the tree in this specific place or who took care of it for all this time, right? And so if you actually get down to sort of what makes a tree, you have sort of the genetics and biology of a tree. And then on top of that, you have the entire aesthetic register, the whole set of expectations in history that make us understand a tree in a certain way and appreciate it, right? And you can see how different this is if you look at, I don't know, an olive tree compared to a Canadian maple tree, right? They're very different things. It's like the difference between a haiku and a sonnet. Like the expectations and their use are radically different. And so I use this to talk about Homer, because for me, an epic is like a tree, right? We don't know where it came from. But we do know, if you know oral formulaic theory, that every line is like a seed or a leaf of a tree that people have worked on and passed down, and that we have aesthetics that have shaped which lines matter, how they work together, and what we expect of a poem. And so I think that over time, we have thousands of hands that have selected and made these traditional epics. And the question is, where do we put the credit? Does it go down to the person who may have written it down at a last moment? Or should it go to the thousands of people before? Or what about the contribution of the 1,000 years after, 2,000 years after, when we've doubled down on the aesthetics based on this epic, right? If we didn't have Virgil and Dante and Milton and 1,000 or 100,000 English classes teaching Homer every year, we wouldn't look at epic with wonder, right? So art is a cultural product that anticipates audiences, that is brought alive by audiences. And at the end, the tension is, what do we credit more? The time and place and the audiences that received it, or that person who, as I see it, was a conduit for the time and inspiration of their people?
Well, I think you know what I think. I think it's both, which is why I love the question so much because, and this is actually a really nice segue into your book. Because, for instance, without Homer, Homeric, the text itself, we wouldn't have something to sort of study and reflect upon and meditate upon. As your book is, the ManyMinded Man, it's a really wonderful meditation on many things, Joel, and I really love your book. It's really meant a lot, and I can't, I pick it up and I look at the different chapters, and really, well, okay, I don't even know how to begin asking my question. So for those who haven't read it, okay, I'll start with that then. What to you now do you think your book was really about?
I mean, that's a good question. I think the book is really about a search for a Greek concept of the human mind in all of its functions and dysfunctions, and also an exploration of how the Odyssey may have functioned for ancient audiences and continued to function for us. So there are two questions that seem not so interrelated, but the second one, how does the Odyssey function in the ancient world and how does it function for us, is directly related to the first. How does it project and communicate a basic assumption of the way human minds work in the world?
Your entry point into the book had to do with from a personal perspective, right? At least your approach, or at least your introduction, when you're talking about how you get there. I found that very intriguing, because I think that when I introduce the epics to anyone, especially my students, high school students, I end up always asking them personal questions first to make them relate. Like, regarding the Odyssey, and that's more relatable than the Iliad to many. I mean, they like the myths. Okay, the myths are a completely different thing. We can talk about that in a moment. I'd love to talk about that in a moment. But as far as how do they relate to Odysseus, it is really interesting, because I say, has anybody ever left a dog behind? Has anybody gone on a journey and come back and realized that things are so different? Has anyone, been searching for, or has gone away and thought about the people they missed and thought about them differently as time has gone on? That sort of thing. And I kind of, I don't want to categorize your book in that way, but I'm thinking it just
Well,
really.
it's always helpful for me to hear what other people get out of the book, because then it reminds me of all the things I forgot in the process of writing it. So another way I could say is, it's almost a book by book journey through the Odyssey that emerged from two sort of journeys of thought that I went on for a longer period. So one of them is sort of at the core a rejection of the way that I was trained to do scholarship. So you mentioned it's personal and it's different. And people go back and forth about whether or not you can be an objective scholar or not, right? And I don't think you can be, and I don't think you can get close to it unless you own your subjectivity, right? You have to embrace who you are, show who you are and why you read a text. And only that way, I think, can you get closer to sort of a shared reading of a narrative. One of the things that's frustrating for me about scholarship is I think reading narratives or art together and getting other people's opinion is what gives the process meaning. Whereas so much of what we do with scholarship is solitary, even though, we're communing with ancients and other scholars in the work, but we're here to sort of tell a story of our own. So part of it has really emerged out of me not wanting to write a book, right? If you go into grad school, you get a PhD and a tenure track job, you have to write a book, right? And my dissertation was really long and it was a monster. And I just didn't want to make it into a book. So I tried not to write one. And I had this, so I'll tell a couple of short stories, narratives here that'll come together. But I was sitting at a dinner with my first Greek professor, Lenny Milner, in 2012 or so, 2013. And he said, well, what do you want to do now that you have tenure? And I'm like, well, what I should do is write a book about speech in the Iliad. But what I want to do is to write a book about psychology in the Odyssey. But I don't know anything about it. And he said, well, you should do what you want to do. I was like, I have permission, as if I needed permission from him after so many years, but I really did. I didn't want to do the smart thing, right? So the second part of this is that, I taught the Iliad and the Odyssey together for years. And I got really into the Iliad at a time when war was literally in the air. I moved to New York City 2 months before September 11th. My first 2 weeks of grad school were basically canceled because of the towers coming down. And then, then we just went back and acted like everything was normal, right? And, I'm surrounded by war protests and, family telling me to come home. And just like now with the pandemic, this constant aching need to make what I do matter. And so at the time, like talking about, an ancient tale of a coalition of hundreds of states going together to the east to fight an enemy who had wronged them, it seemed like an easy parallel because it was filled with all the complexity and the lies of our real world, right? The coalition of the willing was never coalition, and neither was it willing, right? It was all built up by language and rhetoric, creating an enemy where there wasn't one. And I found the difference intriguing between the world of the Iliad, where there is no villain, in our own world, where we try so hard to make an enemy, so hard to make a villain. I remember sitting there watching the news as people celebrated the death of Saddam Hussein's sons and thinking, we are not on the side of the right? We are not the noble ones. And so I went in to teach at UT San Antonio, which at the time was the largest veteran serving institution in the country. My wife was in the Army. And what I found shocking is that while I loved the Iliad and was an expert in it, I could never get students to care about it, right? Like it was too twisting, it was maybe too real, too complicated. And what I found on the other hand is that they just ate up the Odyssey. And, I had always considered, let me take care of her for a second. Hold on. Okay. I had always considered the Odyssey a secondary poem, like not quite as good, not quite as sophisticated. So I really struggled trying to figure out why students loved it so much when I thought so little of it. So, the story I really start the book about is that when things really changed for me, it was in between when our first two children were born. We had a daughter, Alia, in July of 2010, a son, Iskander, in December of 2011, and in between, my dad died suddenly. It was unexpected. It was related to health problems and drug problems of his own making. And it was, he was 61. It was kind of shattering. And I think until you lose a parent, you don't realize how you spent your life. It's okay. How you spent your life with a sort of emotional safety net there, right? And I realized that it was gone. And so in this 18-month period, I became a father, lost a father, and repeatedly taught the Odyssey. And so there are parts of the Odyssey I'd never understood before. The reunion of Odysseus with his father at the end. And to me, when I went home to Maine again to scatter my father's ashes with my brother, for the first time I noticed the trees we had planted, the land we had worked, it aged. It wasn't the same. Yet it told the story as much as the man himself told the story, because he had worked it so hard. And so it just, to me, I understood suddenly what I tell students all the time now, which is that the Iliad teaches you how to die. It teaches you what is worth dying for. The Odyssey gives you the other choice. It makes you understand the cost of living and of surviving, and what's worth living for. So in that way, it's a much harder poem. There's this line that's repeated again and again in the Wheel of Time that actually comes, from samurai culture. And the line is that, death is lighter than a feather and duty heavier than a mountain, right? And then, dying's simple, right? An epic of death and glory, it's easy to understand. But living with all the messiness of life and the scars you carry with you and the mistakes you make and how much you muck up the world, that's not an easy thing. And so part of what I started doing with students as I taught the Odyssey is to just bring in ideas that I had or parallels. So one of the things that I've always done is to read widely in other disciplines. So I had been reading in mainly literary theory, but cognitive science about how narrative works, and really thinking about the way that the Odyssey reflects concepts of personhood and agency. And so I went in one day after reading a really simple concept depiction of learned helplessness. So learned helplessness is a pretty old psychological concept. And the basic idea is if you habituate someone to failure or in being to failure, they'll stop trying at all. And when they do try, they have less success in their execution of events. So, a classic experiment is you have a dog who presses a button and it sometimes gets a snack, but sometimes gets a shock and sometimes gets nothing. It's a cruel experiment, but over time, the dog just stops pressing the button. So there's tons of stuff with studies of learned helplessness, linking it to depression, to suicide, to cycles of poverty, all these things. I just went in with a simple question about book 5. What does it do for us if we imagine Odysseus crying there on the shore as someone who's suffering from something like this? Right? So if we understand that he's not just pathetic, that there's an explanation for him spending 7 years crying on the shore, in that he's just given up because he thinks he can't win, how does this change our notion of the poem and what it does to him after? And so for me, as a proof of concept, the students were like, whoa. And we did something I'd never done before, which is a line by line reading of book 5, which people mainly skip because once Odysseus gets away from Calypso's island, where he's been encased, he like goes to sea and his ship gets wrecked again and he has to swim, and there's all this repeated stuff, and people are like, what's this about? And what I then went about was like, all right, if we're going to imagine that epic is interested in showing how people can have dysfunctional things going on with their minds and their lives, does it also anticipate how you can solve those problems or address them? Right. So, you know, in psychological treatment, there are a couple different ways to deal with learned helplessness, right? You allow people, so cognitive behavioral therapy, you allow people to have success in small stakes and sort of build them up over time. Another one is narrative therapy, where you get people to retell the stories of their lives so that they're agents again, so they have some control. So I got those basic concepts and just started reading about them. And, you know, the Odyssey read to me anew. And I did what people do, which is, you know, I went around and gave some talks about these things. And every time people are like, that's interesting and new, and I buy it, but what about this? And so eventually the project turned into 9 chapters that went in different directions, but starting on that basic revelation that the epic understands, or the Greek epic understands and communicates that things can go wrong with the way we function in the world because of our experiences. But there are still ways to address that.
I have so many responses I was thinking in my head, and I wish I did what I always advise my students to do, which is jot them down as they're going, because you're going to forget them. So anyway, I'm just going to start from this idea that, okay, it is, I think what you said about how we can't get away from our subjectivity when we're being scholars and we're looking at literature is absolutely right. And another one is, unless you read widely from other disciplines, you're not going to have a fresh perspective. You just really won't. And you have to be talking to people from various ages, because we learn so much from the previous generations as well as the newer ones, and how they really relate to things that we're talking about, because every generation looks at a piece of literature differently. Mm-hmm. And it's actually, to me, it's cyclical, because we don't really know what the people who wrote it or related it, you know, whether it's oral or the ones who finally wrote it down, what they were really thinking. We can only guess, we can surmise. So
and the bigger thing, I actually think the next frontier, if there is one for Homeric studies, is we've been worried for so long about what I call supply side poetics. What were the singers and poets thinking, right? But what about audiences? And what I rarely see people asking is, how is the Odyssey different if we imagine women listening to it?
Oh yeah.
How is it different if enslaved people are listening to it? Right? How is it
think in terms of audience, as you know? So
yeah, no, I know you do. I'm not saying, yeah, you're smart, you know these things, but I'm summarizing Homeric scholarship.
No, this is great. This is good. This gets my interest. Go on, please.
No, but so we never ask these questions, right? And so I think part of what makes Homeric poetry successful is that it's ambiguous enough that multiple audiences can read their own experiences into it. But then it wrestles it into a cultural frame that's acceptable. One of the moments in the poem that really makes me think we've only just begun to think about the multiplicality of the text is there's this moment right before book 22 where Odysseus, maybe 21, I'm sorry, where there's a mill woman who's been working all night and has to keep working because she's the weakest of them, and she's weeping and she prays, and part of her prayer is to have Odysseus return to set things right again. And Odysseus is listening and he smiles. And all I can think about is how this poor nameless woman's experience is instrumentalized only to magnify the glory of Odysseus's return. Like, even when we recognize her pain, it's only there in his service. And so it's this thing that Homeric poetry does, where it acknowledges and channels all of the richness of human life, but then at the top puts a reading on it for sort of the authorized audience. And, I think what's happened, over time is that people have read the epics in a very specific way and haven't been willing to listen to those other voices. Sorry, she wants to practice with black plastic. So that's why I think, part of where my sort of investigation went is from starting with, worrying about Odysseus and Telemachus to suddenly realizing, what, we have to worry about somebody else in the poem who suffers from learned helplessness, and that's Penelope, right? What's her life like? Well, what's the life of the enslaved people, Eumaeus and Eurycleia, and how's that work? And then suddenly I found myself making an argument that we should really be sympathetic with the suitors and think about their experiences, because there were audiences in the ancient world who would have taken the suitor's side. And so I think that just sort of the gift to me from working with students from multiple backgrounds, with multiple voices, and having the time to really apply different frameworks to the Odyssey is I found a richness in it that I never would have seen before. And, I think, again, the book, what's it about? For me, it's a journey in realizing the Odyssey is something completely different from what I thought it was, which is tremendously humbling when you spend 20 years studying Homer.
Was it an odyssey for you, Joel? I'm sorry, I just had to say that.
That's all right. At least you didn't say it's all Greek to you.
The journey, that people go through when they read the Odyssey is really, really something. And I got excited over the whole audience thing because I can never put aside the audience, because to me the audience is like my students.
Yeah.
They're the audience.
But actually, I want to appeal to you for a minute, though, as a musician, though, in this, right? Because while I was thinking about this, early on in the days when I was doing research for this, I also had a music blog with my brother. It's defunct, so you can't find it. But one of my obsessions is with cover songs and live performances, and the very notion that something can be the same, and what audiences get over years. I knew this guy, way back in the analog days, who spent most of his time collecting bootlegs of Pearl Jam concerts, right? And there was an entire culture of this and rules about what type of cassette tapes you were supposed to use to record them on, and how fast you had to get them out. Live performances are amazing because music changes over time as the audience changes and as the artist. I've been sort of obsessed with
Yeah.
So
yeah, go ahead.
Go ahead. So Taylor Swift aside, repeated performance is really important for me, because one of the things I realized in going back to the Odyssey again and again is that it's never the same poem, right? And that's really, it's almost too trite to say, but it's worth saying that your position in life changes radically. And with rereading and returning over time, the way you understand a poem changes. And so for me, as a young man, first time I ever read the Odyssey, I was probably, as a boy, I was in high school. I kind of found it annoying, right? Adventurous, sure, but whatever. I read it again, Iliad was better. But having kids, losing a father, it just radically changed it. And it made me realize that when we think about the epics, the biggest thing we're missing is that people in the ancient world lived with them for their entire lives, right? So when we think about their interpretation, their uptake, the influence that the poems have on them, we lose the element of time. The fact that they would hear the stories in part when they were children, they would see the images, they would see them on stage, they would occasionally see the whole story, and it was constantly part of their daily life, their conversation with others. They had people telling them what it was about. And so the richness of their engagement with the narrative is unlike anything we really have today. Like the closest things I can think of is you watch something, you read a book, you watch the movie, you discuss it with people, maybe you write some fan fiction, you do some cosplay, it's all a big part of your life, right? And then sustain that forever, right? And make it part of your adulthood. One of the things I joked about in a review of a book I read once is that you can purchase Harry Potter lingerie, right? Which just seems bizarre until you think of like that people grow with it. You read something when you're 9, you don't need lingerie. You're 29, maybe you do. It's part of like the whole story. So, I mean, the stories change as we grow. Right. Some of it's that they change inside us as they respond to us. Part of it's though is that it does change as the circumstances change. So I'm sorry that that's the example that came to mind, but
Okay, okay. Can I give an example from a musician's?
yeah, you got to cleanse our palate of that very mention.
Okay. So, I had an experience recently. Gosh, so many things just went in my head right now. But okay, I'll start back a little bit. Um, so I was in terms of reception, right? Okay. This one actually involves the Iliad. I never really understood the whole obsession with these, um, shall we say, incest stories. Like I mean, really, I was like, okay, obviously, the Greeks were writing about taboo things. When they're talking about mythology, this does not reflect their values in a
Right.
straightforward way. In other words, you they weren't writing that about the uncle with his niece and so on because that was normal, but rather because that's taboo. Yeah, yes.
That was kind of normal in some city states to preserve property.
At that point in time.
Sorry. Yeah.
No, that and I remember that whole study, and I was like, oh, what now?
Yeah, I know.
53-year-old, no, wait, a 40-year-old uncle was like the perfect husband for you in Athens at a certain point in time because yeah, okay, no, so no, woo, we were trying to cleanse our palate. Don't remember. Okay, going back. So anyway, uh, I was trying to figure out what the heck was going on. Like, what's up with these stories? I would just tend to ignore them and go, I don't know, because I don't understand. So I love the mythology because it was just so weird and different. And again, my brain would just focus on the stuff that I liked, like the idea that there was a heaven and that these gods had powers. And like any, teen or child or whatever, I was like, oh, I want those powers. And I put myself in that like pretending to be Aphrodite, goddess of love, who could do this, or Eros, who could do this. I think that's the fascination from my understanding that my students have, with the mythology, is they want to be those gods, to be in charge of all these wimpy humans or whatever, okay? But when we talk about like who begat whom, their eyes just glaze over and go, what the heck? I go, I'm
Yeah.
sorry, let's just ignore it. Anyway, very recently, I watched The White Queen, which was all about that period in history of the War of the Roses. And there was this part towards the end where Lizzie, his character, gets together with her uncle, King. And so she picks the wrong side for a bit there. And she's with him. And it's like, oh, this wonderful love story, the way they put it together. It's like, they didn't even focus on the fact that it's a forbidden love, but it's just wonderful love and it's passionate. And I was just like watching it going, the weird feeling I'm getting is that one, I'm enjoying this and I don't know why. So I'm like, oh, is this what guilty pleasure is all about? Because I don't think I've ever had this feeling when people are like, oh, my guilty pleasure is watching this. And I'm like, no, I can't relate. But this I was like watching going, gosh, this reminds me of Greek myth somehow. That like you're watching it and you're going, why am I liking this? It's really weird. I don't understand. But it's like that taboo part is just clicking and it's going, I don't even know what to do with it. Should I just like not question it? Should I just like let it happen and then you know um and I thought to myself, okay, to be fair, lots of artwork I don't even question anymore. um and when I find out that this artist did these horrid things but created this piece of art, I go, ah, okay, well, cool. And I just ignore
Yeah.
the that part and just look at the art. And I was thinking, what the heck, back to what the heck was going on with all that, Joel? Any idea?
Well, oh man, you just opened up so many boxes.
I know, I know.
So I want to take this back to sort of a universal and then maybe hit some particulars and
Sure.
get back to modern music. Let's see if I can do it. All right. So one of my long-standing interests has been in what does storytelling do in the world, right? And so often people say, what's the function of myth? But I want to make it bigger and broader because I think people get their minds all wrapped up on how to define a myth when I just want to talk about stories and what they do in the world. And so part of what I lay out in the first or the second chapter of the book is all of the disciplinary perspectives on how narratives shape us as human beings. Psychology, cognitive science, sociology, all help us to understand that we are an overlay of narratives. We tell about ourselves, narratives we've heard, narratives we want to be true, narratives other people have imposed on us. And I'm using the word narrative there. We can use the word discourse, and big things that shape who we are, like our gender presentation, our sexuality, are all shaped by the stories we've heard and the stories that we've told ourselves from what we've observed in the world. All right. So when you go back to this idea, what's a narrative doing? Right? Narratives, myths, help to set a baseline of what's metaphysically and ethically possible in the world. Sometimes, like with an incest story, it tells a story to sort of put a firewall around it, right? To show the exception that proves the rule and the danger of that type of story. Right. Other people say, well, here are stories that allow us to explore taboo, right? To as sort of like a steam release valve, so there's not too much pressure in society. That's sort of what Freudians and others will say about certain myths. And you get to this sort of difficult question for people who study myths, which is to what extent do dangerous stories do bad things in the world? Right. And so we get this as early as Plato. Plato complains in the Republic, or as Socrates complained, that you should never tell the story of the Iliad, because then people will think that being insubordinate to your commander in chief will be possible. He specifically calls out Achilles and says that this is a terrible lesson for people. Right. And today people say, well, maybe that's cancel culture, right? Maybe that's a problem. We want to censor Homer. But it takes me back to another thing I've been thinking about, which is how much bad narratives cause harm in the world, right? And there's no limit for that when it comes to the pandemic, right? How much people's political affiliations, their bad news, their conspiracy theories have actually resulted in death and suffering, right? The lies people tell as stories, they're dangerous. And, in our lifetime, we've seen this, when we were young, the House of Representatives had an entire hearing on whether or not like gangster rap was ruining kids, right? And then, for me, like sort of one of those flashbulb memories is the Columbine shooting. Right. I remember being in a cafe in undergrad, watching it go down, and the discussions later on about how listening to music like that from Marilyn Manson corrupted the kids and made them violent. And I've always been super, super dismissive of such arguments until the past few years. I'll take this back to the Odyssey in a minute, but Marilyn Manson, I'm forgetting the artist's real name. Turns out he's a pretty shitty human being who's done a lot of terrible things with sexual abuse and violence and just been awful to people. And there's been a constant connection between his transgressive music and transgressive behavior. And I just wonder, flirting with white supremacy and Nazism, collecting Nazi iconography, at what level does cosplay and bad ideas eventually translate into bad ideas themselves? So one of the things I've been struggling with during the pandemic is like, we don't have social distancing for bad ideas, right? We don't have antibodies for racism and hate. These ideas constantly get recycled and repackaged and retransmitted because we don't understand narrative's impact on us well enough. And so my book actually, like at the end, what I really focus on is the end of the Odyssey. and the way that the stories we hear constrain us, and the choices given by the epic tradition to its own players are an endless cycle of violence, or just forgetting, right? There's no real solution. Like the tradition that Odysseus has gives no solution to the problem of Odysseus except murder. And so the epic ends artificially. And so I think part of what rich narrative like epic does is it forces us to think about our complicity in the terrible stories we hear and what it does in the world. So to go back to your question, I mean, I don't think it's a guilty pleasure, right? We flirt with taboos because they're taboos. We find them fascinating. We find them attractive. They give us space to explore things that we struggle with. I mean, people don't control what they think of, right? So the famous thing, if you tell someone not to think of an elephant, of course they will think of an elephant. Even Jocasta jokes in Oedipus Tyrannus, oh, many a man has dreamt of sleeping with his mother. You shouldn't think about that stuff at all, right? I mean, there's this line, like the human brain is constantly firing, right? Repackaging stories, putting them out there like the latest variant of a virus. And yet we have no treatment for the bad stories we tell. And so I think that's sort of the quandary and the true impetus for studying narrative still, right? I said earlier, I spent aftermath of 9/11 wondering why the work I did mattered. And I spent 2 years in pandemic wondering again why it matters. And to me, it matters because the damage that has been done by belief is far greater than the damage that has been done by the virus. And we still need to study how stories work, how they shape us, and how they make us and break us, if we want to have any hope for the future at all. I don't know if that's where you expected me to go.
No, that was awesome. Thank you. That I have no expectations. Talking to you is always a delight because I just never know where it's going to go.
Sometimes I don't either. The Marilyn Manson thing has been rattling around my head for a while because I read this just awful, this gut-wrenching expose that I'm not going to summarize for you. But it just made me think like, maybe we have to think some things over again. I also don't like his music.
Okay, Joel, there are two subjects I wanted to talk about. Okay. One, I did want to go back to the whole music and reception of audience thing. The other is psychology. I'm very heavily invested in psychology. It was my first subject that I went into university for. You know, as you know, as a quadruple major. I went in as a triple major and then went back for my fourth. But the first thing that was of interest to me was psychology. And to this day, I tutor psychology. Now that sounds funny because I'm not, a PhD in it or whatever. But I've just been reading from that point to now, and I've been entrusted by parents at this point when they're like, do you tutor psychology for high school or for college? And I'm like, yeah, I do. And I mean, I love reading psychology books. There's this new book called The How of Happiness. I know that sounds like, okay, how is that any good, right? But it's actually one that is solid because it does the basic thing, which is there's a series of small things you can do, and then that's ultimately all you can do. You give yourself small little goals and get to the bigger goal, and that ends up being more effective than the talking about your childhood sort of therapy for people. No, it's really interesting because the studies really show that in the end it ends up working more. That sort of therapy works faster and works for a longer period of time, along with the narrative theory, the one tell your story. Those two in combination work way better than going back and talking about how you're sorry about your past transgressions and so on. And so this kind of takes me back to the Odyssey. It's like you could sit there and talk about how awful Odysseus was, but instead he's problem solving as he's going along. what are his short-term goals? Get out of the island or whatever. Get
Yeah.
there. What are his long-term goals? It's this. Um, I don't like him as a person, but it is really quite interesting how he knows what it is all along. He knows his long-term goal. How he will make himself happy. Get home.
Well, but so I have three responses.
Sure, yeah.
Well, let's see if I can. So the first is, I think I love that you brought up that book. The way I often start conversations with people about this is that we aren't given a manual to the human mind, right? Like we don't know what happiness is most of the time. We don't talk about it. We have like banal platitudes and all this stuff. And I actually think part of the Odyssey's function is in giving its audiences something like that, right? A narrative map through what it means to be a person. And your second thing about how ruminating on past suffering can be completely parafunctional, right? Unless it's paired with sort of, something that's addressing what happens next, right? Because the more you talk about how you were hurt, the more you remain a person who could be hurt by someone else, right? And that completely traps you, right? And then paired with our society's, I think, probably toxic expectations for happiness, right? Like everything's going to be a grand ball, everything's going to be the best day ever. Sometimes happiness is just like a good cup of coffee, right? But then that last thing, the setting of goals and the accomplishments. I think one of the things that the Odyssey acknowledges is that will only take you so far. Because Odysseus gets home, but we always know that he's going to leave again. And right. And this is like, there are several, I end the book talking about some of the poetic traditions that build on that. I'm going to be annoying and actually go to the book, go to one of them because I find them fascinating, right? Let's see, Kavafi says, this is a translation from a man named Kaiser, the end of his poem, The Second Odyssey. The affection of Telemachus, the loyalty of Penelope, his father's aging years, his old friends, the love of his devoted subjects, the peace and repose of his home bored him. And so he left, right? And to me, that's like, it's cuts to the core of the problem of heroic narrative and epic narrative, and the way it engages with our lives, especially our lives today, because our lives are spaced around a series of potential accomplishments. You finish high school, you finish college, you get married, you have kids, and then is it just one slow approach to death? Right? What happens next? Like, where do midlife crises come from? It's because like we need another level, right? The game's not over. We need more accomplishments. We're so used to like leveling up every few years and getting more experience points and new talents that by the time we get to like the rest of our life to live.
Or simply people change, Joel.
Right. Yeah, exactly. So we have no guide to that and we break down. And so for me, it's like the acknowledgement on the part of Homeric epic that epic isn't sufficient is something that people don't acknowledge, that stories aren't enough. People who learn to control stories are those who get a little closer to getting what they want or need out of life. So yeah, I think those are my three responses.
You remembered your responses. That's good. I tend to forget them. My focus on the Odyssey is the women. No, I shouldn't say women, the female voices, because, we got two goddesses who are into Odysseus for whatever strange reason. Three, if you count Athena.
Well, I mean, for two of them, he's the only man around.
Okay, to be fair, well, no. Kirke could have chosen, others.
Yeah, but no, they failed her test.
Mm.
Right.
Yeah, sure. Hermes didn't give them the holy moly.
Yeah.
Holy
Yeah,
moly.
right.
Yeah.
They didn't have the anecdote.
Yeah.
So I always love about that scene. She's like, "Oh, I couldn't enchant you. I guess I have to sleep with you." Right? Like there's no middle ground. Like maybe we just part our ways.
And going back to like, do people change? It's like the two goddesses are just kind of hoping that he'll change his mind. Like no matter how often he says, "I want to go back to my wife," it's like, "Oh yeah, but check this out, honey.
Yeah.
Isn't this cool? Does this make you want to stay? Oh yeah,
Yeah.
I'll stay another year. Okay, cool." And then we get to the poor goddess who's like sitting there in Ogygia going, so it's been 7 years and she no longer pleased him, which implies that she
She
used to
once
please.
did. Yeah.
She once did please him.
But so that moment, that moment constantly grates at me.
Okay.
Because I mean, we all know people for whom nothing is ever enough, right? And there are so many times in the epic where we're invited to despise those who settle, to see Odysseus staying with Calypso as a failure, to see the men who want to stay with the lotus eaters as perverse, right? To even consider listening to the siren song as a problem unless you have an out clause. But after all is said and done, everything for Odysseus is getting home. We know that he's going to go traveling again. So it's just like, so that's what I mean, in later traditions, Odysseus became a favorite of Stoic philosophers for his ability to endure, but he should be a favorite because he can never answer in positive the question, quod satis est, like what is enough, right? And that's part of what Odysseus asks us to consider is what's enough to live happily. When I remember reading the Lotus Eaters once, especially soon after my dad died, thinking, well, this is about drug users. But then when I looked at it again, I was like, nobody asked them if they were happy, right? It's like that, I forget which character it is in the Matrix who betrays Neo and just wants to go back having his steaks and enjoying fake life. That's not an irrational choice. It may be an unheroic one, but it's not necessarily irrational.
I I told my students, I said, if you trace like the reasons why Odysseus's crew doesn't trust him, you know, here are a couple of them. One, the Lotus Eaters. Like, what harm is it to just sit around and freaking relax? I mean, chill out. After all they've been through, they just want to eat
and they
some
die,
lotuses.
and they
Like,
die because they follow him. Like maybe they spent their life,
yeah,
maybe they would have
exactly.
spent their life stoned otherwise, right? But at least they would have lived.
That's right. There's that. And, my students just laugh and I go, but seriously, like, you know, they've been following him around just based on faith or whatever. And he has, so far he hasn't delivered on the promise of getting them back home. So, hey, can we just chill out and just have some lotuses? These guys look like they're having a good time. Let's just have a good time for a little bit. And he drags them back. And I'm just like, oh my God, he won't even let them have their like piece of chocolate or their wine or whatever you want. Do it. Wait,
I
okay.
think you're probably
All
being
right.
too kind to what the substances are.
Okay,
No,
I'm
it's
being
because you
kind,
teach high
but
school kids.
yes, I did look into the Blue Lotus for them though, and I went into a
It's
little
a rabbit hole.
yeah, it was quite a rabbit hole looking into that whole thing. But yeah, it's a matter of trust too. Like, do they trust this guy since one, he won't let them have a good time. Two, um, you know, that whole Polyphemus in the cave thing was really quite questionable.
No, he admits he was wrong on several occasions. I mean, he's not a good leader. Did you want a question about music? Was that the other
Oh
one?
yeah,
Before
real
music
quick.
psychology?
Yes. Sorry. Let's get to this.
Okay.
Music and the who your audience actually is. So when let's just say Homer. Don't make me leave the room, Joel. But okay, let's say Homer or a bard. Let's say Demodocus, if it makes you happy. A bard, is singing, and he gets to the end of the Odyssey, and he's singing about Athena, saying, stop this, right? Like as I did for Center for Hellenic Studies. So she's singing like, stop, don't, you have to stop this madness at this point. You can't just go around attacking everybody who's offending you. The war has stopped, right? And at the end of the whole thing, that's how it ends. With like she had to intervene, and that's strangely enough how it ends with her being in the guise of a mentor, of mentor. Is that, oh my gosh, that is actually, yeah. And that's how it ends, you know? And it's like, okay, so let's take it back a bit. Homer is singing and the audience is listening. And they're supposed to understand that this is the ending of this. The ending is, so you shouldn't war anymore. So it's is that really like, is that the message all the way from the Iliad? You know,
I
begins
mean,
with sing wrath and it ends with
I
okay.
think you know that the ending of the Odyssey is so problematic that there have been hundreds of scholars willing to say that it's not the right one, right? I don't play with that, right? But I think you're right. Seeing the continuity or continuum with the Iliad is definitely one way to do with it. But I think that the audience may have walked away a little angry, right? No, I'm serious, and because I think it's supposed to create a specific effect, which is discomfort, to make people wonder, wait, how did we get here? And the analogy I always use is a Socratic dialogue, right? So the early operatic ones for aporia, getting to a place of pathlessness, will take you through a question like, hey, what's friendship? And you have all these debates, and at the end, you're like, I still don't know what friendship is. And what that emphasizes is two things. One, that you took a wrong turn along the way and you have to do the debate differently. But two, the process of the debate, the dialectic, is more important than the product. So that jarring into the Odyssey, I think, is supposed to make people think, shit, I want to hear it again. I didn't get it right, or we made some wrong turns along the way, and to make them walk away thinking, what just happened? Right? A good example, right? People still talk about it years later. It's the final episodes of final episode of Sopranos, when Tony Soprano is in the diner and the screen just goes black. People are like, what does that mean? And I don't care what the creator says it means, right? What I care is that people still talk about what it means, right? They're allowed to read into it. And that power of art, when you can allow people to read something into it, without disambiguating it, makes the audience the author, right? And so I'll end it with an anecdote, the debate I always have with my brother about music. So the song by the Pixies, "Where Is My Mind," allegedly was written by Frank Black after he went scuba diving in Puerto Rico, near Puerto Rico. And my brother tells me that's what the song is about, right? But for 20 years, I listened to that song. I didn't know that that's what it was inspired by. And it meant a whole different range of things to me that changed over time and was changed again when it ended the movie Fight Club. And suddenly I'm like, oh, well, this is something else going on. And it becomes a history of the song, right? And at the end, like, I'm author of that version of the song. It means something in my life. It's part of a journey through time that I've taken. And perhaps I've given it meaning that Frank Black didn't intend. But he and I don't talk about things. I don't know him, right? Instead, he has been, to me, a conduit for this amazing song to the world that each person gets to remake anew. And so at the end, for me, like learning about, like, you in the end, you're like, what's the Homeric question? And I would change it to like, what's the question of authorship in general? Right? The soft version is, oh, we don't know about Homer because of oral composition. The hard version is, maybe most artists and authors aren't as important as we think they are. And the genius comes from all of us and not just a few individuals.
Well, thank you, Joel. This was absolutely wonderful. Thank you for giving me 2 hours of your time. And I could keep this conversation going. My next question would be like, so what do you really think about Achilles? Because I love Achilles, but my brain has been was colored from the beginning by reading Laura Slatkin's.
Okay. Sorry.
Oh, it's okay. By reading Laura Slatkin's Power of Thetis, that was my entry point into Iliad, really, and because of that, it was colored that way. So even when I was watching Troy, I'm all, oh, Brad Pitt, that is his
But
son.
so people, other people become part of your interpretation.
That's it.
But this is where, like, again, one thing before I leave, the other night my wife said, "Do you think book clubs are good?" And I think she was shocked by my reaction
Oh,
because I'm
okay.
an academic, but I was like, I think they're absolutely necessary,
Thank goodness.
because you need other people to help you bring flesh to the world.
Yes. Yes, absolutely. All right. Thank you, Joel. And you told me that we can go part two sometime. I'm very
Yeah,
excited to hear that. Yeah.
let's do
Excellent.
it.
Thanks again.
No problem, Bettina. See you soon.